Hi everyone, so last night we had the patch notes drop for Diablo 4 Season 2 and with that the new uniques and legendary powers, and I want to go over them in this video. Unfortunately we don't have the full details on all of those items yet. We did get a few screenshots here from Blizzard for some of these items including their stats. However, not all of them actually show their stats, so this is a kind of big part for some of those items. And this will also kind of determine how good or how bad they are. But at least we can talk about the unique effects, which are generally actually pretty cool and pretty powerful as well, I believe. And we also have all the legendaries where stats doesn't matter or doesn't exist. So let's go into it. I'm going to start with the uniques and then the legendary powers. So there's a total of 12 new uniques, and some of them are class specific, some of them are going to drop from Duriel. So there's, I think, 6 new drops that are dedicated to Duriel, but they can also drop anywhere else. It's just that you can target farm them there, including the Uber uniques, and then the others are like sprinkled in somewhere with the other bosses. So this is how that's gonna work. If you've been enjoying this video so far, then you're probably here to learn something about the game and improve your own performance. And this is where the sponsor of today's video comes in, ROG, Republic of Gamers. They sent me their high-end ROG Ally. This thing is basically a handheld, powerful PC. It can do anything that a PC can do, and it can run all of the games from your Xbox Game Pass, Steam, Epic Game Store, and of course Battle.net on it. And as the icing on the cake, they actually gave it a custom wudijo Diablo 4 design. How cool is that? Not only is this a great handheld device to use on the go, it also has 2 additional modes. First, you can connect it to a TV and pair with controllers to play it basically like a console, or you can combine it with keyboard, mouse, monitor, and have a full desktop experience. You can even upgrade its GPU performance by connecting it to the ROG XG Mobile eGPU and have this similar performance to an RTX 4090 laptop GPU. When I was playing on the ROG Ally, I was really impressed by how smooth it feels and how easy it is to get into it. It allows you to play Diablo 4 or any other game you like from anywhere and log in exactly at the right time to catch that world boss, do a trade, or just have some fun and blast. And if you also want to try out the ROG Ally for yourself, I have it linked down in the description, so go take a look there and get it for yourself. And finally, we're giving away 1 ROG Ally to a lucky winner in the comment section. Just comment, which game would you like to play on that device? Now, the first one is Tassets of the Dawning Sky. It's a generic unique pants that says when you take damage from a non-physical damage type, you gain 6 to 10% maximum resistance to that type for 6 seconds. Now, that is a relatively strong defensive effect coming there in Season 2, because they have reworked resistances. So if you have not seen that yet, resistances are going to be additive up to 70%. So adding plus 10% maximum resistance basically cuts the remaining damage taken into 2/3. So this is quite a lot of extra damage reduction. However, it only works for one element and only after you got hit at least once. So to be honest, I'm not really too impressed with this thing. This is relatively good if you know what you are fighting, like if you know that certain damage types are going to be affecting you, like in new boss fights, for example. So I could imagine this to be useful there. But outside of that, probably not really that great. And I would probably just go with like a better defensive legendary power. However, if this thing has a ridiculously good stats, then this might be worth using. Next up is Godslayer Crown. This is one of my favorites here actually. It's a generic unique helm that says when you stun, freeze or immobilize an enemy or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies, and you deal up to 60% multiplicative increased damage to them for 3 seconds. And this can occur once every 12 seconds. Now, I think this is a relatively busted item, to be honest. So the pull-in, we don't know exactly how that will work. It might be pretty large, might be pretty small. It might not really matter too much, but I think just pulling stuff in will be really helpful for some builds. You know, these small scale AoE builds, let's say like Rend, for example, Whirlwind, or these kind of things that just don't really hit many targets. They might really benefit from this. And on top of this, you also deal a massive amounts of extra damage. Now, if you can actually transform this damage boost into your entire burst, basically by using cooldowns or you know, you have to exploit glyph window to 3 seconds of vulnerable and these kind of things. Now that's gonna be really crazy, I believe, especially because you get a pretty massive damage multiplier on an otherwise actually defensive slot because it's a helm. So I think for any kind of build that has burst damage, that has cooldowns that it can use in this 3-second window, where you can like snapshot extra damage or something like that, that's gonna be pretty crazy. You just burst down bosses. I'm thinking about something like Poison Imbue Rogue, for example. You also use a Poison Imbue to start 2 attacks. They're both buffed, and the poison is gonna take with that extra damage. So pretty strong item, I believe. If it has okay stats, I think it's gonna be super good. Then we have Flicker Step. They have actually shown us that one. This is when a pair of boots that says each enemy you wait for reduce your ultimate cooldowns by 2 to 4 seconds up to 10 seconds. Now that is a really crazy item. So we have a screenshot of that here. We also have pretty decent stats on this thing. So it has movement speed at least, it has damage reduction from close enemies. All stats is okay, and ultimate skill damage. So that is all pretty fine. It has attacks reduce evades cooldown as the implicit. But yeah, up to 4 seconds ultimate cooldown reduction, up to 10 seconds per evade. That is pretty crazy, especially for classes or builds that can actually reset the evade or have extra evade charges from somewhere or something like that. So Rogue can do that, for example. You can reset your evade cooldown even faster. Or something like Sorcerers with the teleport. You can actually way more easily hit multiple of those enemies and teleport through enemies with the teleport enchant. That should probably work. So in general, I think this is going to be a pretty powerful item for builds that really rely on high ultimate uptime. So this can also just be used in between while you're just, you know, kind of waiting for your next attack or your next cooldown, and will be universally strong, I believe. It's a pretty good item. Then we have Tybalt's Will. This is a generic pair of pants where it says you deal up to 40% increased damage, multiplicative, while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after. And when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 of your primary resource. That is also a really powerful item. Kind of similar story as Godslayer's Crown. It's an offensive item on a defensive slot, and actually Pants is a purely defensive slot. You can't even put the utility powers there. So you get a pretty big multiplier and you get resources. So for some builds, I think it's going to be really good. Like you imagine you combine this Godslayer and Tybalt's Will. Let's say you're tanky enough somehow, and you go with those 2 items, and as a rogue you shadow step into the boss, you get your unstoppable for the 40% damage, and then you also get your 60% from the crown, and then you do your combo, your burst. Like, it sounds pretty crazy. And some builds also have relatively high unstoppable uptime, especially for example like stuff like Grizzly Rage, Shadow Clone can give you like a long time of unstoppable. Barbs in general are unstoppable very often, and they are quite tanky, so they can actually afford losing a defensive slot. And there's also going to be a vampiric power that makes you unstoppable all the time when you evade. So pretty crazy. I think this is going to be a really strong item if the stats are not really terrible. Then we have Xephal's Corroded Signet. That is kind of interesting. Seems to me like a Necro ring mostly. It says generic unique ring, but realistically I think only Necros are going to use this. But the effect is kind of powerful. So it says lucky hit, your damage over time effects have up to 50% chance to erupt, dealing 5 to 6 damage of the same type to nearby enemies. Now 5 to 6 damage looks very small, but that actually scales to ridiculous values. So I don't know exactly, but most of these like flat damage effects actually start at 0 point something at like level 1 basically, and then they just keep scaling up to actually useful values at level 100. So what this means is that this effect is probably going to reach like the 5 digits at least, like tens of thousands of damage basically when that triggers, as like the flat damage value that it says later on the item when you actually find a high level unique. So I don't know exactly, I haven't done the math on that now, but it will be a really high value to the point where I think this is almost a mistake that they put that number there. And well, there is one damage over time skill in the game that does ridiculous amounts of lucky hits, and that is Corpse Explosion, the Blighted Corpse Explosion in particular. Actually, I'm not sure if that's intended, but however, the way it works is that it has 40% lucky hit, and that triggers on every single dot tick. because the skill just thinks that, you know, it's usually like a corpse explosion, it has 40% lucky hit, it goes boom, that's it. But when you do the blighted corpse explosion, you get, I believe, 8 seconds of 2 ticks per second with 40% lucky hit. So you have like a combined total lucky hit value of like 400, 500% or something like that. And this means you're gonna trigger everything all the time. It's actually a 6-second dot. So it's that effect. So with that, you can trigger this effect like crazy, and I believe that Blighted Corpse Explosion Necros with this are going to be completely nuts. So Infinimus and these kind of things. I'm not sure if there's any other lucky hit dot effects that could be useful there, but at very least that exists. Then we have a Soul Brand, generic unique chest. It says your healing potions no longer heal instantly. Instead, it grants a barrier for 200% of its healing for 4 seconds, and while you have a barrier, you gain 20% damage reduction. Kind of decent item, I believe, for especially builds that already have barriers, because it just gives you this damage reduction like under any circumstance basically. And then you have this little barrier here that you can get. So it sounds like only the instant portion of the healing potion gives you a barrier, so not the 35% like base life healing basically. And this means the barrier is going to be kind of small, like a level 90 potion gives you like, I don't know, 1000 something healing instantly. So you're going to get something like a 2000, 2500 barrier or so, which is kind of nice. And it might be able to actually trigger conceded aspects. So if you actually have a lot of healing potions, or you can produce a lot of healing potions, for example, rogues have an aspect that can actually produce healing potions, this might actually be an interesting combo to use. Other than that, I think this is mostly going to be like a SORG item or so, because of this effect, where you actually can have barrier uptime consistently. Then we have Banished Lord's Talisman. It's a unique generic amulet that says, after you spend 300 primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower, and your critical strikes that overpower deal 120% increased critical damage. Now that is a really strong effect, I believe. Now they did nerf crit and vulnerable, and they buffed overpower. TLDR, crit and vulnerable are way weaker than before, and overpower is way better. In the end, I think we're still gonna see crit builds, we're still gonna see overpower builds, and we're still gonna see vulnerable builds. And combining two of those effects with this amulet, crit and overpower, especially for builds that can reliably trigger overpowers, is going to be a really powerful effect. So you have to spend 300 primary resource for this guaranteed overpower, which is quite a lot. But if you can regularly crit and regularly overpower and kind of combine the two often enough, I think this actually has a pretty massive burst potential. Especially when you play something like a Blood Necro with guaranteed overpowers every few attacks, and then you also have really high crit chance. Yeah, this can definitely do a lot here. But it also depends a bit on the stats. This effect might seem very large, you have like really bursty damage, but it's still relatively inconsistent. So you somehow need to get very high crits, somehow have to get very consistent overpowers, and then it's fine. So it will depend a bit on the stats of this item. So if the stats are not good, I don't think this item is going to be that great, despite this high damage multiplier. Then we have Task Helm of Joris the Mighty. It's a Barbarian unique helm that says, when you gain Berserking while already Berserk, you have 40 to 60% chance to become more enraged, granting 15% multiplicative damage and 2 fear per second and 10% cooldown reduction. Now, kind of the same story as the other helm here. This is an offensive item in a defensive slot, basically. It will depend on the stats as well. However, in general, this looks like a really strong item. Barbs in general look like they're gonna be pumping in this season. They buffed Berserk to be overall multiplicative already, so basically every single build is gonna run Berserking. And if you can somehow trigger this again, for example from the legendary Paragon node that just gives you Berserking on kill, or you play Upheaval that gives you Berserking every time you attack, you're gonna trigger this all the time basically. So it doesn't sound like it stacks, but at the very least you get basically these bonuses here at all times, and those are all really good bonuses. So I think this is a very good helm, even if the stats are not that great. Then we have the Dolmen Stone. This is something that I've actually previewed in the in the live stream as well. There was a little clip of that that says, casting Boulder while Hurricane is active will cause your boulders to rotate around you. That looks actually really hilarious. I'm not sure if you have a screenshot of that as well, but yeah, it's a really really funny item. can basically play like Hammered In Druid or something like that. And it seems like it makes Boulder actually somewhat useful. So I'm kind of excited to see what will come out of that. If people are going to play stuff like a Boulder, Hurricane, Nature's Fury, Druid or so. I believe this could be an interesting new build. And the stats on this also seemed okay. So it's basically like a build enabler for Druids here. Then we have Blood Moon Breaches, Necromancer, Unique Pants. So this one says the acquaintances have a 7% chance to curse enemies, and enemies affected by at least one of your curses take 70% more with the increased overpowered damage from you. This is a really strong item, I believe. So 7% chance to curse. We don't know exactly how this will work, but I guess this means that they either randomly apply one of the two curses, or they randomly apply one of the curses you have on your bar. So this means you're probably gonna run like Decrepify, for example, and then your minions will just attack and then eventually gonna proc this. However, the proc chance is somewhat low if you look at this. So this means you need something like 15 or 14 attacks on average to proc this from your minions. So it's not very consistent, even if you have a lot of minions. So that is quite low value. But if you curse yourself and then you get this 70% extra multiplier here, and then you overpower a lot, like a Blood Necro, like Blood Lance and Blood Surge, both of them overpower regularly with ease, I think this can be really good. It has this blood theme anyway, so I guess there might even be like skill ranks to blood skills, or some overpower related stuff on these pair of pants, making them an even stronger offensive option. And especially for Blood Surge, I believe, where you already want to have a lot of minions, if you will combine this with the Death Speaker Pendant, I believe it's called, the unique amulet that gives you these mini blood knowers on your minions. I think this is going to be a really strong combo. Next we have the Scoundrel's Leathers. This is a rogue unique chest. So we have a screenshot here as well. This is something they have previewed here, where it says, while you have unlimited energy from inner sight, your core skills have up to 80% chance to spawn Caltrops, Poison Trap, or Death Trap. Very interesting item. It's again an offensive chest, an offensive defensive item, so to say. The stats on it are somewhat okay, I guess, but not really great. So they have one real damage reduction mod, then they have dodge chance, and then they have these two trap mods here that are not really going to be that strong. So what this means is that, well, you can actually play like a trap inner sight build now, and if you have a lot of attack speed, and you can actually achieve a lot of attack speed, especially in Season 2, you can get to the point where you easily attack like 2 times per second or something like that. You have a 4 seconds infinite energy window with inner sight, and you do like maybe roughly 8 to 9 attacks in that window, and 80% of those attacks are going to trigger one of the traps, which means you probably trigger at least 6 or 7 of them, so each of them twice on average per inner sight proc if you attack with very high attack speed. So you get 2 death traps, 2 caltrops, 2 poison traps on average. It doesn't sound that bad, honestly. I think this can be pretty useful for some builds, where especially the death trap triggers and pulls everything in and decimates. I think this is going to be a relatively strong combo. Caltrops are really nice here because they give you like really strong damage multipliers as well, as like an extra damage buff, for example, when you stand on the boss and the fight actually lasts for a few seconds. So kind of interesting item to play around with. Not 100% sure where to fit it, but I think it has its place. And lastly, the last unique item is Blue Rose, a sorcerer unique ring. It says, lucky hit, damaging an enemy has up to 30% chance to form an exploding ice spike, dealing 0.25 to 0.35 cold damage. This is kind of like the example I explained above here with this ring here, 5 to 6 damage, and then 0.25 to 0.35. You see the difference. So this corroded ring here has its insane value, and this is, yeah, I don't know exactly what this will end up, probably a few thousand or something like that on high level. Now, it has an extra effect here where it says triple this chance if the enemy is frozen, so you have 90% lucky hit to form an exploding ice spike when you hit enemies. So it's basically an enabler for ice spikes for not the typical Blizzard builds. I'm not really sure if that's going to be so good, but you do have pretty high lucky hit on some builds on a Sorc, for example on Ball Lightning, against Mega Spam Ball Lightning. There's probably like a few other examples, maybe like Arclash or so, where you can attack really fast and also hit many targets. So you can actually quite easily spawn these ice spikes and then combine it with the other ice spike powers. However, I don't think this is really like a buff to the existing Blizzard sword with ice spikes, and also it doesn't really seem that powerful in general to me. Let's see what the stats will say, but kind of meh item, I believe. And here are the legendary aspects. So there's going to be a few class-specific ones and a few generic ones. The total we have 7 new aspects here, and I think they're also going to be on the codex again. So let's start with the first one. Aspect of Slaughter, generic mobility aspect. It goes on the boots or the amulet. You gain 20% movement speed and you lose that bonus for 2.5 seconds after taking damage. Basically very defree inspired with Crown's buff belt. Kind of nice effect, I think. Just universally useful when you do any kind of, open world content, and it might actually not drop when you have a barrier. So we'll see. If that is the case, then this is actually really strong, I believe, for barrier classes like Sorc, for example. Then we have aspects of elements. This is generic offensive aspect. Again, very defree inspired here. So it says you gain 30% additive damage to a set of damage types for 7 seconds. And this alternates between 2 sets, Fire, Lightning, Physical, and then Cold, Poison, Shadow. This is absolute trash. I think this is more fluff than anything, especially because of this additive damage. It actually spelled out additive damage here. Not even a multiplier for a legendary power. That is very strange. This is like really worthless. And that's probably kind of good because a lot of people very much dislike Convention of Elements in Diablo 3. So it also really doesn't make much sense to combine these element types. There's like not many classes that can actually combine 2 of them at the same time. Okay, Rogue can do physical and then that, and Sorc can do this and then that, but realistically, yeah, we have most builds using like 1 real main attack and that's about it. Then we have the Want-On Rupture aspect. There's a Barbarian offensive aspect that says your Rupture does not remove the bleeding damage from enemies. This can occur once every 30 seconds. Now that is a very interesting one. So this will basically mean that you walk up to the boss and you dot them up with Rend, for example, and then you Rupture, and then you Rupture them again. So you basically have like a double nuke once every 30 seconds. And especially for, like a build where you're kind of like struggling with bosses, this can be a really insane combo, especially if you combine this again with, for example, the Godslayer Crown unique that I mentioned. If you have this kind of like burst potential, then you can also multiply the value of, for example, the Godslayer Crown and this insane burst that it can do. So could be kind of nice. However, it has a really long cooldown, so it's really only useful for like those boss fights or some other like really big targets and like structures you have to defeat in dungeons and these kind of things. Outside of that, not really too great. Then we have a Raw Might aspect, the Druid aspect. After you hit 15 enemies with your Werebear skills, your next Werebear skill will deal up to 50% more damage and stun enemies for 2 seconds. Now, it seems relatively good. You're gonna have 50% multiplier most of the time. If you blast into packs, you stun enemies all the time. It is kind of nice. However, I think if there's one thing that Werebear skills don't really need, especially Polarize, that's more AoE damage. You need single target damage to kill bosses, and for that reason, I believe this item is just not really going to be that useful. I would rather just focus on more generic multipliers and try to actually have extra damage against bosses as well, because it's not that hard to actually one-shot packs. However, that is kind of the opposite when you, for example, go into high-tier nightmare dungeons and the fights slow down a bit and you're generally more interested in just getting through the dungeon, and then the boss fight can be a bit longer, it doesn't matter too much. So in that case, this might be really good for like higher end content where monsters actually live for a while and you just one-shot everything. So it does have its use, however somewhat niche in my opinion. Then we have the aspect of Artful Initiative, a rogue offensive aspect. When you spend 100 energy, you release a cluster of exploding stun grenades that deal 0.2 to 0.3 total damage and stun for 0.5 seconds, and your grenade skills deal 15% more damage. Well, they do try to make grenades viable. There's also a glyph that buffs grenades now. However, I mean, grenades in general are pretty laughable. First of all, there is no grenade skill that actually deals damage in the game. There's only smoke grenade, that's the only grenade skill, so to say, and that doesn't do any damage. So we're kind of like lacking an expansion that actually gives us, a grenade basic skill, a grenade core skill, and maybe a grenade unique. ultimate. So maybe then it's gonna be somewhat useful. Until then, I don't know, 100 energy to spawn some stun grenades. I mean, it is somewhat useful to combine this with frostbitten aspects, for example, like people have been doing in Season 1 with the grenade heart, for example. But 100 energy is much harder to proc than the grenade heart, and it's not really on the same level. I don't think this is such a good aspect, and you also still need a combination with frostbitten aspect to get something really good out of this. So yeah, not very convinced, to be honest. I'd rather focus on more generic multipliers. But for builds that spend a lot of energy really fast, especially rapid fire builds, you can basically output a lot of energy really quickly, and those builds might also combine this with preparation. So you have kind of like the same scaling synergy, and this might be somewhat useful in those cases. Then we have almost the last one here, aspect of the Long Shadow, Necromancer aspect, that says, lucky hit, your shadow damage over time effects have a up to 30% chance to generate 3 essence, and damage from your Shadow Blight key passive will always generate 2 essence. Now, this is actually a relatively strong resource effect, I believe. Interestingly, as it's an offensive aspect and not a resource aspect for whatever reason, I don't know why. So this actually does not go only on the rings, but you can put it on many different slots. And well, again, I talked about the Corpse Explosion. That is a shadow damage over time effect and has insane lucky hits. So this can be used as kind of like a, you know, essence refill, where you just press your Corpse Explosion once or twice or something, and you have a big pack, and your essence gonna go brrr, yeah. So this is what I expect there. And with the Shadow Blight key passive, kind of the same story. If you have many targets and you have these Corpse Explosions going on the ground, with the dot effect ticking on everything, this is gonna trigger really, really fast. So for those builds, it can be useful to kind of like refill your resources with Corpse Explosion, but we'll see how good this will be exactly. And then lastly, we have the Battle Caster's aspect. This is a sorcerer aspect that says, lucky hit, when your conjuration skills hit, you have up to 40% chance to gain +1 rank on the conjuration skills for 12 seconds, can stack up to 3 times. So basically you get 3 ranks on the conjuration skills, so you go from like 9 to 12, for example, on your Hydra. That is fairly decent, especially if you combine multiple conjuration skills. I think that's kind of like a theme they're trying to make work right now. Then this is actually a really good aspect for such a build. So it is very niche, but quite useful when you play such a build. So I think this is a pretty good one. And that's all of the new uniques and legendaries here. So I think there's actually going to be a lot of really good stuff in there. Very interesting that they put so many like very offensive powers or very offensive uniques in some defensive slots. So we'll see how much people are going to be tempted to actually, you know, basically skip all defenses and just like try to stick everything in their builds there. But overall, I think I'm going to see some really crazy stuff with some of those uniques. There's definitely a potential to make really strong builds with these, really strong, like, you know, burst and like glass cannon type builds. So quite excited to experiment with those, honestly. I think they did a pretty good job here. A lot of these uniques and legendaries seem useful, at least under some circumstances. So let's see what they will actually do in the season, what kind of stats they will actually have. And that's it for this video. So I hope you enjoyed this. Wish you good luck in the season 2. I'm going to keep you guys updated with a lot more videos, so stay tuned. We're also working on the Maxwell updates, of course, so that is coming out very soon as well. Hope you liked this, and see you guys next time.